I stared at my phone screen in the middle of the airport terminal and felt my stomach drop right alongside my heart. Derek had sent one final message before blocking me. I've met someone who can actually help my career. You understand, right? Then the little gray checkmark turned into a red exclamation point, and I was officially erased from his life. I was stranded in Chicago O'Hare on a 5-hour delay with nothing but rage and an empty stomach. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I marched up to the nearest gate agent and asked with a smile so wide it probably looked deranged. "Excuse me, do I need to cause a scene to get one of those delay meal vouchers, or can I just ask nicely?" The agent, a tired-eyed man who had clearly seen it all, handed me 2 meal boxes without a single question. I took my spoils to the gate and ate everything. Every cracker, every fruit cup, every sad little square of processed cheese. I was defiant and grieving, and I was not going to waste free food. That decision followed me onto the plane like a vengeful ghost. By the time we reached cruising altitude, my intestines had declared war. I hunched in my economy seat and tried to breathe through the waves of pain, but it was a losing battle. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, I bolted for the lavatory. The line in economy was already 6 people deep. I did not have 6 people worth of time. I lunged toward the first-class curtain and found the lavatory door locked, occupied. I banged on it with my fist, tears streaming down my face. "Please open up, I'm begging you!" The door swung inward, and I lifted my head through a curtain of sweat-soaked bangs. I was prepared to shove past whoever stood there and deal with the social consequences later. What I was not prepared for was the man who opened it, Julian Cross. He stood there in a perfectly pressed charcoal suit, his dark hair swept back from a face that had once graced the cover of every architecture and business magazine in the country. Julian Cross was the founder of Cross Ventures, the real estate visionary who had reshaped half the Manhattan skyline. He was also a guest critic during my final year of architecture school at Columbia. The students called him the Myth, because he walked into a room like he already owned the building and never said more than 10 words. And I had just pounded on his bathroom door like a feral animal. I didn't have time to process the cosmic humiliation. I ducked under his arm and slammed the door shut. 20 minutes later, I emerged, convinced the worst was over. I had planned to slink back to my seat and pretend I had never existed. But Julian Cross was leaning against the galley wall, arms crossed, waiting. "Ava Sterling." His voice was low and smooth and completely unbothered. "You're still at Hartman and Wright, aren't you?" I froze. Not only did the Myth remember me, he remembered my firm. I managed to strangle yes while my brain screamed at full volume. He tipped his head slightly. "The peppermint tea will help. And maybe don't eat 2 full meal boxes before a flight next time." I wanted the floor of that plane to open up and swallow me whole. I didn't see him again until we landed. I was hobbling through the jet bridge with my carry-on dragging behind me when he fell into step beside me as if we were old friends. "My car service canceled, and I have a meeting in an hour." He looked at me with those calm, steady gray eyes. "Would you be willing to give me a ride into the city?" I owed him my dignity, or what remained of it, so I said yes. We were halfway across the Whitestone Bridge when my phone rang through the car's Bluetooth. "Ava, it's Marcus from the mentorship program. Your intern Lily collapsed on the site visit. They're taking her to Mount Sinai West." I yanked the wheel toward the exit, and Julian put a steadying hand on the dashboard. "Drive," he said quietly. "I'll deal with the meeting." At the hospital, Lily was pale but stable, surrounded by a cluster of anxious architecture students. And standing right in the middle of them was Derek. My ex was holding hands with a woman I recognized immediately. Sabrina Hollis, daughter of Franklin Hollis, the developer who had just awarded Hartman and Wright the biggest contract in firm history. The students were whispering, "Isn't that Ava's boyfriend? Why is he with Sabrina Hollis?" Sabrina spotted me and her mouth curved into a cold smile. "Ava, how nice of you to check on my sister." "She's Lily's sister? I should have known." Before I could answer, Sabrina shoved past me with a deliberate shoulder check that sent me stumbling. A hand caught my elbow. Julian Cross steadied me, his expression carved from stone. He looked at Sabrina, then at Derek, and said in a voice that could freeze salt water, "The doctor needs a family member to sign consent forms. I suggest you focus on that instead of assaulting people in hospital corridors." Sabrina's face went white. She recognized him. Everyone in our world recognized Julian Cross. Later, after the chaos settled, Julian found me in a waiting room chair. He knelt down and lifted my ankle gently onto a stool. I hadn't even noticed it was swollen until he pointed it out. He pulled a packet of arnica gel from his jacket pocket and applied it with careful, steady pressure. His fingers were warm and precise, and I had to look at the ceiling to keep my composure. Derek appeared in the doorway. "Ava, can we talk?" Julian's hand didn't move from my ankle. He looked up at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Do you want to talk to him?" I nodded once. Julian stood and stepped back, but he didn't leave. In the hospital garden, Derek fed me the same tired speech he'd typed out in his breakup text. "You're incredible, Ava, but I need someone who can open doors for me. Sabrina's father is going to make me a junior partner." I threw his cheap engagement ring at his chest. 3 years, I said. 3 years, and you trade me for a corner office? He didn't even flinch. He just walked away. I sat on the bench and stared at the dying flowers in the planter. Then a hand appeared in my line of sight, palm up, fingers long and elegant. Julian Cross looked down at me with something that was almost a smile.
"Get up. I'm taking you to dinner." We ended up at a small Italian place in the West Village. I drank 2 glasses of Chianti and told him everything. About Derek, about my mother's medical bills, about the years I'd spent clawing my way through architecture school on scholarships and side jobs. Julian listened without interrupting. When I finally ran out of words, he raised his glass. "To the end of wasted time." I clinked my glass against his. "To the end of wasted time." He studied me over the rim of his wine. "You know, I remember your thesis presentation, the one about adaptive reuse of industrial waterfronts." I nearly choked. "You remember that?" He set his glass down. "You were the only student who argued with me. Everyone else nodded and took notes. You told me my critique missed the community impact angle entirely." I had forgotten that. I had been so nervous that day, I'd blacked out most of it. "I was right," he said quietly, "and I've thought about it ever since." The next morning, I woke up in my apartment with a pounding head and a complete blank where my memories of getting home should have been. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I put oatmeal and your favorite pastry on your doorstep. Drink water. J. Cross." I opened my door and find a bag from the bakery around the corner, the one I'd been obsessed with during grad school. Inside was a still-warm almond croissant and a container of steel-cut oats. How did he know? How did he remember that bakery? I sat on my kitchen floor and ate the croissant in 4 bites while my heart did something strange and fluttery. For the next 2 weeks, Julian Cross texted me every few days. Nothing personal, just links to articles about adaptive reuse projects, questions about my current work, a photo of a building he thought I'd find interesting. I responded with professional enthusiasm and tried very hard not to read anything into it. Then he showed up at my office. I was in the middle of a project meeting when our receptionist poked her head in, looking dazed. "Ava, there was someone here to see you." Julian Cross stepped into the conference room and every single person at the table went silent. He smiled his calm, devastating smile. Hartman and Wright invited me to give a guest lecture on large-scale urban development. I thought I'd stop by and say hello. The lecture was scheduled for that afternoon. I sat in the back row and watched him command the room. He was brilliant, of course, but what struck me was how kind he was with the junior architects, how patient with their questions. Afterward, a woman swept into the room. She was stunning, tall with dark hair and sharp cheekbones and an air of absolute confidence. Julian, you were supposed to call me back about dinner." She grabbed his arm and he led her. Something in my chest clenched. Of course, I thought, a man like Julian Cross would have someone like her. Sophisticated, gorgeous, probably a CEO or a gallery owner or a diplomat. The woman turned her bright eyes on me. "Oh, you must be Ava. Julian's mentioned you." I smiled so hard my cheeks ached. "All good things, I hope?" She laughed. "Mostly." Julian coughed and his ears went faintly pink. "Sofia, let's get lunch." As they walked away, she glanced back at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity, maybe, or mischief. A month later, Hartman and Wright held their annual firm retreat at a lodge in the Adirondacks. I almost didn't go. The thought of watching Julian and the mysterious Sofia parade around as a couple made me want to fake a stomach flu. But I was up for a senior associate promotion, and skipping the retreat wasn't an option. So I packed my bags and boarded the firm bus. The lodge was rustic and beautiful, perched on the edge of a lake with mountains rising behind it. The first day was filled with team-building exercises and strategy sessions. I threw myself into every activity with aggressive enthusiasm. I volunteered for the trust fall. I dominated the bridge building competition. I led a nature hike. I was so busy being productive that I successfully avoided Julian Cross for 6 straight hours. Then came the evening bonfire. We gathered around a massive stone fire pit with drinks and blankets. Sofia was there, wearing a sleek black jacket that made her look like a Bond villain in the best possible way. She stood up and clapped her hands. "All right, everyone. We're playing truth or dare.
I tried to slip away toward the lodge, but Sofia caught my wrist. Not so fast, Ava. You've been hiding all day. Sit. She steered me to a long bench, and I ended up directly next to Julian Cross. He was wearing a dark sweater and jeans, and his hair was slightly damp from the evening mist. He smelled like cedar and something clean and expensive. I stared into the fire and willed the game to be over before it started. The bottles spun around the circle, landing on junior architects and project managers. People confessed to embarrassing war crushes and sang terrible karaoke and did push-ups in the dirt. I relaxed a little. Then the bottle landed on me. Sabrina Hollis was there as a client representative, who smiled sharp as glass. Truth, she said with false sweetness. When was the last time you cried over a breakup? The file crackled. I met her eyes.
Last month, on an airplane bathroom floor. And honestly, I've never felt better. Sabrina's smile tightened. The bottle spun again and pointed at me. I groaned. Truth or dare? Sofia asked. Truth, I said. Is there anyone here tonight that you find attractive? My heart slammed against my ribs. I could feel Julian's presence beside me like a gravitational field. I kept my eyes fixed on the flames. No. Sofia tilted her head as if she didn't quite believe me. Your turn to spin. I reached out and flicked the bottle. It wobbled and spun and came to rest pointing directly at Julian Cross. The entire circle went quiet. Dare, he said, his voice perfectly calm. Sofia leaned forward, her eyes glittering. I have the perfect one. She whispered something in my ear. My face went hot. Sofia, no, I hissed. She just grinned and sat back. I stared at the ground and forced the words out. Kiss someone here for 1 full minute. No one moved. Then someone started clapping. Sabrina's clap was loud and mocking. A few others joined in, half nervous, half thrilled. Kiss, kiss, kiss! The chant built around the fire like a drumbeat. Julian Cross stood up. He looked at me and the firelight caught the edge of his jaw and the deep gray of his eyes. He walked toward me and the crowd's chant grew louder. I thought he was going to pick Sofia. Everyone thought he was going to pick Sofia. His hand came up and cupped my chin, gentle and firm. He tipped my face toward his and I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. Hunger and hope twisted together. He leaned down and kissed me. It was soft at first, almost questioning. Then his hand slid to the back of my neck and he deepened the kiss and the world shrank to just the warmth of his mouth and the thud of my pulse. Someone screamed. It might have been Sofia. It might have been me. When he pulled back, my brain had completely shorted out. Done, he said, his voice low and rough. I sat there frozen for what felt like a century. Then I scrambled up and fled into the lodge. I hid in my room for 3 hours. I paced, I hyperventilated, I pressed my fingers to my lips and relived the kiss 17 times. Around midnight, a knock sounded on my door. It was Derek. I opened it just a crack. He looked disheveled and desperate. Sabrina dumped me, he said. I realized I made the biggest mistake of my life. I started to close the door, but he jammed his foot in the gap. Ava, please, I love you. We belong together. We're the same kind of people. Something inside me snapped. I yanked the door open. What kind of people is that, Derek? I work hard. I'm good at my job. I pay my bills. I help my mom. What exactly about me says I should settle for a man who trades me for a promotion? He flinched. You think you can have Julian Cross? He's playing with you. He and Sofia Hollis are practically engaged. I heard it from her father. If he really wanted you, why hasn't he shown up tonight? I opened my mouth to respond, but a new voice cut through the hallway. Because I was getting something. Julian Cross walked toward us, and he was carrying the biggest bouquet of white roses I had ever seen. He was wearing a black suit jacket now, his hair combed back, and he looked like a prince stepping out of a fairy tale. He handed me the roses, and they were so heavy I had to brace them against my chest. Then he turned to Derek and, without a word, punched him square in the jaw. Derek hit the floor with a crash. Julian shook out his hand and looked down at him with cold disgust. Don't you ever speak to her like that again. Derek scrambled up, his lip bleeding, and lunged.
But before he could land a blow, Sofia appeared from nowhere and twisted his arm behind his back in a move so efficient and brutal that Derek howled. "What the hell?" Derek shouted. Sofia smiled sweetly. "I forgot to mention, Julian is my brother. Different last names. Don't assume." The hallway went very, very quiet. I stared at Sofia, then at Julian. "Your sister?" He rubbed the back of his neck, a flush creeping up his throat. "She just moved back from London. She asked me not to tell anyone at the firm because she wanted to be judged on her own merits. I thought it was a good idea at the time." He stepped closer and took my free hand. "It was a terrible idea." "Because you spent a month thinking I was with someone else, and I spent a month trying to figure out why you kept running away from me." My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. The roses were trembling in my grip. "Julian, He lifted my chin the same way he had at the bonfire. "Ava Sterling, I have been half in love with you since you stood up in a Columbia lecture hall and told me I was wrong about waterfront zoning. Every single thing I've done since I walked back into your life has been because I wanted you to see me. Not the guest critic, not the billionaire developer. Just me. So please, stop running. Tell me you feel even a fraction of what I feel, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." Tears were rolling down my cheeks, and I didn't even care. I stood on my toes and kissed him. The roses were crushed between us, and petals scattered everywhere. When we broke apart, Sofia was cheering, and Derek was slumped against the wall, looking like a man who had lost everything. Julian pulled me into his room and closed the door, and kissed me again against the doorframe. "Wait," I said breathlessly. "You really remembered my thesis presentation from 4 years ago?" He laughed softly against my lips. "I remember everything about you, Ava. The way you chew on your pen when you're thinking, the fact that you always order the same almond croissant from that bakery on 112th, the way you argued with me for 10 minutes about community engagement and then sent me a follow-up email at 2 in the morning with 3 additional citations." I stared at him. "You kept that email?" "It's printed and framed in my office." I didn't know what to say, so I kissed him instead. We stayed in the Adirondacks for 2 more days. Derek left early and no one missed him. Sofia spent the rest of the retreat taking credit for our relationship and demanding we name our first child after her. Julian and I walked around the lake and talked about everything. He told me about growing up the son of a construction foreman, about building his company from nothing, about the years he spent so focused on work that he forgot to have a life. I told him about my dad leaving when I was 12, about my mom's illness, about the constant fear that I was 1 bad month away from losing everything. We fit together like 2 pieces of a broken thing that somehow made each other whole. The day we got back to the city, Julian took me to his office. On the wall behind his desk was a framed email printed on plain white paper. The subject line was Waterfront Critique Follow-Up. At the bottom was my name. He had kept it for 4 years. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, a simple band with a single emerald that matched my eyes. He didn't get down on one knee. He just held it out to me with an expression that was equal parts terror and hope. "Ava, I'm asking you now because I've already waited 4 years, and I don't want to waste another day. Will you marry me?" I looked at the ring, at the framed email, at the man who had punched my ex and kissed me in front of a bonfire, and remembered my croissant order from a bakery I hadn't visited in 2 years. I said, "Yes, yes, yes." He slid the ring onto my finger and kissed my knuckles and then kissed me. The wedding was small, just Sofia, my mom, Julian's dad, and a handful of close friends. We got married in the fall at a restored industrial warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront, the same kind of building I'd argued about in my thesis. Julian had bought it and turned it into a community arts center. He handed me the deed as a wedding gift. "You were right," he said. "It should have been for the community." I cried so hard my mascara ran, and Sofia had to fix it before the ceremony. We've been married for 2 years now. Julian still texts me every morning, even when he's traveling. He still brings me almond croissants on Saturdays. He still argues with me about architecture and then stays up late reading my rebuttals. And every time I look at my ring, I think about that bonfire, about the way he looked at me before he kissed me, like I was the only person in the world, like he'd been waiting his whole life for that moment. And I realize he probably had. Julian's perspective. The first time I saw Ava Sterling, she was standing in the back of a Columbia lecture hall holding a coffee cup and a crumpled site plan. She was a fourth-year architecture student, and I was a 32-year-old guest critic who had been asked to evaluate thesis proposals. I was prepared for the usual: polite students, nervous presentations, safe designs. Ava gave me none of that. She walked up to the front of the room, pinned her drawings to the board, and spent 20 minutes explaining how the abandoned grain silos along the Gowanus Canal could be transformed into mixed-income housing with ground-floor community kitchens and a public market. When I asked her about return on investment, she didn't back down. She pulled out a spreadsheet and walked me through her pro forma line by line. When I pointed out a zoning conflict, she had the relevant code section highlighted and ready. When I suggested her design was overly ambitious, she looked me straight in the eye and said,
"With respect, Mr. Cross, ambition isn't the problem here. The problem is that developers like you have spent decades ignoring communities like this one." The room went silent. I stared at her and felt something shift inside my chest. I've been in boardrooms with billionaires and negotiating tables with foreign governments. I've never been as intimidated as I was in that moment by a 21-year-old with a coffee stain on her sleeve. I gave her a measured critique, and she argued with me for another 10 minutes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her arguments, her conviction, the way she'd looked at me like I was the obstacle she'd been training her whole life to overcome. I sent her an email at 3 in the morning with a few follow-up thoughts. She replied at 2 in the morning with 3 additional citations and a polite but firm rebuttal. I printed the email the next day and put it in a drawer. I kept track of her after that. I knew when she graduated at the top of her class. I knew when she got hired at Hartman and Wright. I knew when she started dating a man named Derek, who everyone said was good-looking and ambitious, and completely wrong for her. I watched from a distance and told myself I was being rational. She was too young, I was too busy, she had a life that didn't include me. But I couldn't stop thinking about her.
I bought a building in Gowanus and started developing it according to her thesis proposal. I told myself it was just a good investment. Then I saw her at O'Hare. She was standing at the gate, stuffing food into her mouth with a kind of determined despair that made my chest ache. I recognized the look of someone who had just had their heart broken and was trying to fill the hole with carbohydrates. I booked a first-class ticket on her flight and arranged to be seated near the lavatory. I know that sounds calculated. It was. When she banged on the door, I opened it and saw her face streaked with sweat and tears, and I thought, there you are, finally. The rest was just a matter of not letting her slip away again. The hospital, the ankle, the dinner, the texts, every interaction was a thread I was weaving into a net. I knew she thought I was interested in Sofia. I let her think it because I was terrified that if I revealed my feelings too soon, she'd run. So I waited, and I planned. And I asked Sofia to suggest the dare at the bonfire. Yes, that was me. I told Sofia everything months ago, and she's been conspiring with me ever since. I needed Ava to see that I would choose her, publicly, unequivocally, in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. When I kissed her by that fire, I was shaking. I'd waited 4 years, and it was better than anything I'd imagined. When she ran away, I let her go, because I knew she needed to process. And then I got the roses, drove up to the lodge, and punched her ex-boyfriend in the face. That part wasn't strictly necessary, but I enjoyed it. She said yes. She said yes at the warehouse on the waterfront. She said yes at the altar in front of everyone we loved. She says yes every morning when I kiss her awake and every night when she falls asleep with her head on my shoulder. I printed her thesis and framed it next to the email. The building in Gowanus is finished now. It has community kitchens and a public market and mixed-income housing. It's named the Sterling Building. She cried when I showed her. She argues with me about every new project, and I let her win most of the time. Because she's usually right. And because watching her light up when she proves her point is the greatest privilege of my life. The bonfire moment is what people ask about. They want to know if it was spontaneous, if it was fate. I tell them it was a dare. But the truth is, it was 4 years of patience and longing and a love so deep I built an entire building just to prove she was right. And every single day I get to wake up next to the woman who told me I was wrong about waterfront zoning. I've never been happier to lose an argument.